So, you may have seen some slightly awkward pictures this morning of Keir Starmer wearing a white bow tie in London's Guildhall.
And he was looking very awkward in Downing Street last night, putting up his Christmas tree. Well, I say putting it up. Obviously,
you mentioned this,
he
Camilla.
didn't have it over his shoulder.
Oh.
It was like the lights switch on and he was there with Lady Vic. And it just... He's not a very natural performer. He's not, is he? He's that lawyer that never really tried a case in court.
You can't imagine Keir Starmer dancing. That's the key to me.
I don't want to imagine Keir Starmer dancing.
Key test. But I'll tell you one thing, though, Camilla, about him.
What?
At least he's got his Christmas tree up,
that's
which is
low.
not true in the Tominey household or the Ahmed household.
And we are rubbish. And by the way, on that, update on that, I came back last night and the kids were like, we're getting the tree up tonight. I was like, it's Monday. I'm putting it off to this weekend. I'm just going to tell you that now.
OK, well, let's have some pictures of that on the socials for next Monday. Looking forward to that. We can hold you to that deadline. On the white tie, do you remember the Gordon Brown abandoned white ties? I think it was 2007 Mansion House speech. The Mansion House speech, very, very grand occasion when you usually speak about foreign policy. Gordon Brown wanted to be more of a man of the people. And he said, I'm not wearing a white tie anymore. Thank you very much. I'm going to wear a black tie.
And do you remember the only foreign leader who Jeremy Corbyn was willing to wear black tie for? Xi Jinping, the Chinese communist.
So, long-standing tradition, the Prime Minister goes to the annual banquet held by the Lord Mayor of London. It's not the elected mayor, Sadiq Khan, but the ceremonial mayor. This was the 696th banquet. God, there's a lot of history there, isn't there?
We're great at history. We're great at history, unlike the Americans.
We've been having this for hundreds of years. Absolutely brilliant. Luckily, Keir Starmer's only given the one speech, but maybe we'll have a few more. The PMs usually use that occasion to make a big foreign policy speech. So, as well as getting ready for Thursday's a reset that's not a reset, of course, shush, whisper it, it's not a relaunch, Keir Starmer was figuring out what can I say on foreign policy that will make clear what this Labour government is all about. And there were a couple of chunks that made headlines. Here's one of them.
When President Trump graciously hosted me for dinner at Trump Tower, I told him that we will invest more deeply than ever in this transatlantic bond with our American friends in the years to come. And we will rebuild our ties with Europe too. Because, I'm sorry to say, the shocking legacy this government inherited in so many areas, from the nation's finances to the state of the NHS, extends beyond our shores. They turned their back on the world, took vital relationships for granted, neglected some allies and spurned others. Our reputation as a trusted, stable, dependable partner was replaced too often with an image of disarray.
Sorry, I was just nodding off there. He's not the best speaker at the best of times. A gracious host.
Very odd use of that word. It
very
deliberate.
Beats David Lammy describing Trump as a neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath. I suppose it's a bit more accommodating, isn't it? There's this suggestion that Trump's going to France at the weekend to see Notre Dame refurbished, and he might pop over to the UK.
Possibly.
Could be a bit orcs, couldn't it, if Lammy's in the building?
I just one other point on that clip we've just heard of Starmer. A lot of those criticisms can be made of the Conservatives in government domestically, all over the place. On the foreign stage, actually, the one thing that the Conservative government is famous for, and Boris Johnson, is backing Ukraine. They backed Ukraine in a way that the European Union didn't initially, was much more negative about. And Boris Johnson actually, on the foreign stage, showed the UK to be very much playing its part. So I think Keir Starmer is, because he's so desperate to get this story that the Tories were bad at everything, even when they weren't. If he had been more gracious, to use his word that he's used on Donald Trump, he would have said, I am proud that the previous Conservative government did these things to support Ukraine. He's also said in the House of Commons that he welcomed the fact that Rishi Sunak talked to Keir Starmer when he was in opposition about the weapons they might be using in Ukraine, what the latest moves were in Ukraine. You remember the first PMQs when Keir Starmer was Prime Minister. he thanked Rishi Sunak for how on foreign policy the Conservative government had been cooperative with the official leader of the opposition. So what is Keir Starmer saying? He said previously they've been actually some powerful things have happened to the Conservative government. And now, in what shouldn't really be a political speech, he's criticising the previous Conservative government. I just think he, again, hasn't learned what being Prime Minister should feel like.
Still campaigning. Also, he still blames the Tories for Brexit, but we'll get onto that in just a minute.
Later.
Now, why is he sort of talking about the EU in relation to our relationship with America? Well, this is on the back of Trump's senior economic advisor, Stephen Moore, saying that Britain would have to choose between the US-UK so-called special relationship and closer ties to the EU, which Trump has described, to be fair, as a mini China. Can you say Trump and China without saying it as China? No, I don't think you can.
I loved your Notre Dame.
Notre Dame,
Notre
baby.
Dame.
Here's what Stephen Moore told Radio 4 a couple of weeks ago.
The UK really has to choose between the Europe economic model of more socialism and the US model, which is more based on a free enterprise system. And I think the UK is kind of caught in the middle of these two forms of an economic model. And I believe that Britain would be better off moving towards more of the American model of economic freedom. And if that were the case, I think it would spur, the Trump administration's willingness to do the free trade agreement with the UK. I think it would make sense for both Britain and the United States.
That is the key criticism of Keir Starmer's speech. I'd say a couple of things. We both read it in full. He mentions Clement Attlee and Winston Churchill. I would say, first of all, wind your neck in a bit, Sir Keir.
Don't put yourself in that company.
Winston Churchill fought and won a war. Clement Attlee led the United Kingdom through the post-colonial era. He was the person who decided Britain could no longer be such an imperial power and that the Commonwealth of Nations was going to be the option it chose. Those things had to be done in the face of opposition. You had to make a choice. Keir Starmer's speech is about all things to all people. We can play towards the EU, we can play towards America, we can be a good friend to everyone. That doesn't work as an argument. And to suggest that Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee are in some way to be described in the same breath as Keir Starmer when he comes up with this speech, which at its heart does not have a central idea, because a central idea has to be about a choice, the choice that Winston Churchill made to fight to the last breath to defeat Nazi Germany, when many others were saying that wasn't the right route for the country. Clement Attlee on the end of imperialism. These were significant historical moments. And also, of course, Clement Attlee and his Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, joined NATO and went nuclear. Many people on the Labour left in that era were anti-going nuclear, anti-following America and Russia to becoming a nuclear power. Ernest Bevin famously said, "Do not send me naked into the chamber." These were massive choices. Keir Starmer is nowhere near making those types of arguments. And so the problem he has is he doesn't have that kind of sophisticated political way of thinking, because there is a judgment here to be made, just as Stephen Moore was saying. The UK does need to decide, or needs to be clear, because I think the inevitability is, in the end, America has to bend towards the US. We always have. If you think about Tony Blair and the 1999 Chicago speech, liberal interventionism, that ended up with the conflict in Iraq and us backing America, the famous Jonathan Powell quote, who was chief of staff to Tony Blair back in Number 10 Now, him saying to the ambassador under Tony Blair to get over to Washington, get up the arse of the Americans and stay there. We always go towards the US. What Keir Starmer should do is he should be speaking truth to his party. The United States and Trump, that is the big theme.
Yes.
That is the big theme of the next 4 years. And how am I, as the leader of the United Kingdom, not the leader of the Labour Party, how am I going to navigate that?
It's all a bit naughty. He's trying to suck back up to the EU. He's obsessed with impressing Emmanuel Macron, who's on his way out in France misreading the mood there. I mean, what a time to be talking about realignment with the EU when the EU is increasingly resembling a complete basket case. You've got Marine Le Pen now, on the verge possibly of deposing both Macron and Michel Barnier, famously associated with the EU negotiations back in 2016, now on a precipice. You've got Germany, on its economic knees. He's boasting...
And facing an election.
Facing
probably,
an
yeah.
election.
Yeah. Olaf Scholz is... look, his political career is in
Scholz,
a real mess.
He's like, the sort of weakest leader in the entire European Union, seemingly, not just economically, but also just on policy and indeed defence. You've got in one breath Starmer boasting that we should be leading the G7 when it comes to growth, which is an admission that some of the other G7 members that are in Europe aren't doing very well, when in fact we should be emulating America because they are actually leading the G7 when it comes to growth, in fact, doubling everyone else's. Like or loathe Trump, I totally agree that in the same breath that you say, if America sneezes, we catch a cold, if America prospers, we benefit from it anyway. The main competition for the City of London now pretty much is New York. People used to talk about Paris and Milan and Frankfurt, but that's gone by the wayside. If you're a high net worth individual and you're wanting to invest in a country which has a good rule of law, a good university and school system, nice places to live where people understand you, you're going to think to yourself, well, New York or London? So that's the kind of main point of competition. And yet they shy away from this because they keep on talking about European neighbourliness. Look, by proximity, we're always going to be close. Also, Starmer's never understood his history on Churchill, by the way, because one of his arguments when he was banging on about Remain, and let's not forget all of the times this man tried to thwart Brexit, I certainly won't be forgetting them, even though he wants history to wash over his completely illiberal and anti-democratic approach to the vote in 2016.
He wanted the second referendum. Yeah.
He wanted the second referendum. He probably still wants it now and is pretending he doesn't. He was banging on about, it was Churchill would have been a Remainer. He was the one who wanted this great European League of Nations. Yeah, he didn't intend Britain to be in it. He wanted Europe to behave itself. Churchill's opinion was, we, like the Americans, can rise above all this. So again, that's mischaracterised, but it's regressive. And I agree with you, Kamal, bad politics.
I remember Jonathan Ashworth, he was trying to say this to praise Keir Starmer, former Labour MP Jonathan Ashworth, now head of Labour Together, regular guest on the Daily Tea. We do love him. He said that Keir Starmer was very much like Olaf Scholz. That actually is the problem that he has, that Olaf Scholz has been a rather crab-like leader of Germany. As you say, the two biggest countries in the European Union, France and Germany, are in a real mess. And this, as well as not making a choice between US-led or European-led foreign and economic policy, which is what he should have done, also, there were other huge things missing in this speech. No mention of Brexit. So you're absolutely right, Camilla. People must be suspicious. Well, why aren't you mentioning the biggest issue about our relationship with the European Union is that we're not in the European Union. So obviously we've made a choice. The public has made a choice. We are going to be more transatlantic than we are going to be trans-channel. Yeah. That is the choice the public have made. He should have said what that means. The other thing, Chagos Islands. No mention of the Chagos Islands, and also no mention of the United Nations. And what role should the United Nations have, given the criticisms it's had in the Middle East, given the discussions about who should be permanent members of the Security Council, and what has Trump said about the United Nations, which he's probably net negative about, as well as NATO. He does mention, Keir Starmer, that he wants to be on this path from 2.3% of GDP on defence to spending 2.5% on GDP on defence. But he still hasn't said exactly when he's going to deliver it. Let's move on to something that he did actually speak about, at least, which was Ukraine. And he said that the country would have to prepare for negotiations.
So we must continue to back Ukraine and do what it takes to support their self-defence for as long as it takes, to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for negotiations so that they can secure a just and lasting peace. on their terms that guarantees their security, independence, and the right to choose their future.
It's interesting how the rhetoric has now slightly changed. I wonder all these world leaders get together and say, look, we need to adapt slightly different language, because this, of course, comes after President Zelensky himself talked openly for the first time, this was on Friday, about the possibility that land occupied by Russian forces may have to be given up in peace talks. Let's just remind ourselves what he told Sky News, who asked him if a solution to the war could be for Ukraine to join NATO, but for Russia to keep the land that it's taken so far.
Yes, it could be possible, but no one offered. But the invitation must be given to Ukraine within its internationally recognized border. You can't give invitation to just one part of a country. Why? Because thus you would recognize that Ukraine is only that territory of Ukraine and the other one is Russia. So legally, by law, we have no right to recognize the occupied territory as territory of Russia.
That, in turn, Kamal, seems to be a change in direction following the election of President Trump for a second term in the White House. Although, do we believe his claim? How are we to interpret his claim that he would have this all sorted out within 24 hours? Because his detractors have suggested, because he's just going to concede to Putin. Yet at the same time, he's been very punchy recently, just in the last 24 hours, in his rhetoric about Hamas. Trump doesn't want to be seen as somebody who's going to be a pushover for a Russian dictator. What's your interpretation?
I think that's right. I will sort of bow to our expertise on Ukraine the Latest podcast. We had Francis Durnley on, and he was saying that it is impossible to see how this can be sorted out in less than a year, 18 months. You're going to have negotiations. So you're right, not 24 hours. I think that for Keir Starmer, it is very difficult. He talked about backing Ukraine and not allowing Russia to win. Now, if Russia retains the Crimea, which it invaded in 2014, and the land that it is taken with this subsequent invasion in 2022, that is a win.
Yes.
They have done that. And again, is Keir Starmer being straightforward with the public as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom that this is the situation we find ourselves in? The President of the United States wants a new solution, or even put it in the words of J.D. Vance, the Vice President-elect, who has made it very, very clear. And we are going to have to come to some sort of negotiated settlement. But why say Russia must not win? Well, Keir, they have.
Yes. And equally, how does Putin play this as well in the face of somebody like Trump versus Biden? Because he can't turn around to the mothers of Russian soldiers and say that this has all been for nothing by conceding back that territory. So are we now, the mood music internationally is very much paving the way for some kind of compromise. And to be fair to Trump, that has been brought about by his re-election. I think we have to accept that, right? You know, Joe Biden has never really held his end up strongly when it comes to US involvement in this conflict, largely because it doesn't pay any political dividends. It's a different situation for us because we're closer to it geographically and because of how Boris Johnson initially approached the war sort of morally, whereas I think America's that far removed.
I think for Ukraine, they're going to have to sacrifice territory for some form of relationship in NATO, not full membership. It is unlikely that it's going to be Zelensky who is actually going to be in those negotiations. He's going to be he was the war leader, like Winston Churchill. They need to find their Clement Attlee, who is the peace leader. They'll have to go through that process in some way. And Russia will gain land, and Ukraine, you assume Starmer needs to get us to a position where Europe is encouraging America to allow some form of relationship with NATO. So West Germany, for example, in the Cold War was not a direct member of NATO, but it had a relationship where NATO was clearly going to support the existence of West Germany. Something similar has to be built for Ukraine, because it's difficult to see how Putin would ever agree to having a NATO member the size of Ukraine right on his doorstep.
Should we just have a chat about the Trump tweet about Hamas? Because, I mean, I'm going to be accused now of wearing an invisible MAGA hat. But it's quite refreshing, this. You know, in comparison to Russia must not win and other sort of fence-sitting exercises that seem to be demonstrated by woolly and liberal types. Trump, he's threatened to hit Hamas, quotes, harder than anybody has been hit after it emerged that an American-Israeli soldier was killed on October the 7th. Trump has said that there would be, quotes, all hell to pay if Hamas did not release all the hostages. I can't speak. Trump has said that there would be, quotes, all hell to pay if Hamas did not release all hostages it still held in Gaza by the time he takes office in January. Well, thank you, Trump, for acknowledging that there are still hostages there. I mean, it was only 5 minutes ago that someone somewhere was calling for a ceasefire without actually mentioning the release of the hostages, which would have been a sort of complete slap in the face of any Israeli. So, I mean, I don't mind that tough talk.
All I would say, he's given himself a very high bar, and frankly, Israel has unleashed all it can against Hamas, and they are still existing. It is very hard to defeat in totality terrorist organizations. So I take your point about
at least he's picked a side.
The tenor,
a side.
Oh, for sure. The tenor of Trump's words might be liked by people who support that type of strong talk. The facts on the ground are, though, can he actually achieve that? I would say pretty unlikely.